What is up, you guys? Welcome back. Today I am joined by guest Mark Derian, who has his own channel here on YouTube, and he dives really deep into psychology. He was getting a PhD in psychology before he dropped out. Really went in depth, coming up with his own sort of approach to therapy. A lot of his ideas are based on Carl Jung's ideas, which, as you'll find out, have a lot to do with the things that we talk about on this channel. I mean, figuring out yourself, your own personal story, your own personal narrative, and how things play out in your life, understanding that and the way that you relate to the world around you is very much I would say, integral to your therapeutic process in a way that is, I would say, probably more deep or more helpful than a lot of traditional therapies.
Yeah. Well, like I say, if you go to therapy now, it's probably going to be cognitive behavioral therapy, which is precise, but it's also shallow. I think they sacrifice a lot of depth to make it precise and to give you these packets that you can work through clearly. And I'm not saying it's not going to help, but that's probably not therapy. But then on the other end, you have depth psychology or psychodynamic, and it goes deep. It gets to the root of the issue, but it's vague. Like we were talking about with Jung before we started recording. I mean, I was reading Jung throughout my 20s, and I realized, he has everything figured out. He figured it all out. Religion, the difference between psychology and philosophy, what's the point of everything? But it's very vague. Mm-hmm. And I think he was just not a very good communicator. Like he always jokes around how NFs in the personality type and the Jungian typology, if you're intuitive and feeling, then you're like not a very useful man. He always makes fun of NFs for not being useful, but he was, the quintessential NF, and he didn't communicate well. And some stuff that he probably didn't have to talk about that much, he went on for volumes, and the stuff that I think he needed to talk about the most, it was just like half of a paragraph, so yeah, a lot of what I've done is I've taken Jung's ideas. Like if Jung was a ENTP, I'm not saying I am, or ESTP. That's what I'm doing. I'm like communicating Jung from that perspective. I'm like, wait, what are we doing here? How does this apply to therapy? What does therapy actually look like now because of this?
Right. And then for everybody watching this, what does an ENTP stand for?
Extroverted, intuitive, thinking, perceiving, meaning that you think more about extroverted things, or I guess it would be ENTJ would be ideal. I'm not saying I'm an ENTP, but whatever the opposite of Jung is. Mm-hmm. He was probably INFP. Maybe not, maybe INFJ, because he was very exacting in certain parts of what he was writing.
So. Yeah, it's so interesting because I remember I took a personality test and I took this, I think it was back in 2020. And I don't remember the exact thing, but it was a EN something. So the thing is though, that I have a very introspective aspect of my personality as well. So it's like, even though I have that extroversion, I have both. I don't know. There's just so much, I feel like, nuance that goes into, and that's why I think like going into all of the things that you talk about, when it's archetypes, talking about like, one thing that I've been considering a lot lately is that these different archetypes exist throughout time and space, like Jung talks about. And it's kind of like we slip in and out of these different archetypes a lot of the times as we're living this movie that is our life. And it's a lot easier to observe in other people. There's also this other model of I don't know what the name of the model is, but there's a book called The Games People Play. And in that book, they have a model of parent, adult, and child. But it's like we're always shifting in and out of these different states of consciousness and these different archetypal characters almost, depending on the scenario, depending on who we're engaged with, the dynamic. And it's really fascinating to me being able to kind of pull back so that we're not caught up in the movie as a character, that where all they can see is just what's in front of them. But a lot of other spiritual teachers like Eckhart Tolle talks about like the power of now, and it's just like becoming the observer, becoming the witness to this story that's playing out. So,
well, it sounds like you could be talking about persona too. Somebody's persona, like they're presenting a certain way to a certain person. That's a different kind of role that somebody plays. Like, like psychologists, go to a psychologist convention, they're all wearing, the tweed jacket with the leather patches, right? It's like, oh, this is a role I'm playing. But which is why I think, and again, I think this is something that when people get into Jung, they kind of get backwards, not because it's their fault or anything, but Jung was very clear that archetype integration came after affect regulation. So you need to get good at regulating emotions before you even think about archetype integration. Like who are you, right? You don't know. I mean, part of who you may be just this persona that you only constructed to cover up some insecurity you have. So you got to figure out how to regulate that insecurity, how to do shadow work, I guess people would call. Shadow work to make that more conscious, so you figure out who you are. And then once you have a better idea of who you are and what you like, what you don't like, what your identity is, I would say, then you can start to integrate archetypes and say, okay, what roles am I going to take on? Where am I? Where am I in the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover? If you're ENTP, your therapy is to be, it would be the opposite, ISFJ. And what does that look like? And there's a bunch of great information online about like, hey, if you want to be more ISFJ, here's what you do. Or if you're more of a magician, probably what you need to do is, run for city council or something. Be more of a king or a queen. Yeah, and I think that's something that people get backwards because, like the distinction between introverted, extroverted, I think there's an interesting philosophical distinction, but the way how most people talk about it now, it's not a real distinction. Like extroverts means, oh, you're social. Introvert means you're shy. But are you really shy, or is it just anxiety? A lot of people say, well, I'm introverted. No, you're shy. You have anxiety around people, right? And you don't feel comfortable. If you're extroverted, mostly you just don't like being alone. And so you got to figure out that through a therapeutic process, and then you can start going, okay, what role am I going to live out here? Archetypes are great because like here are roles that are useful to humanity. This is who we are. Where do I fit in? What can I do? Given where I am, and I think we were talking about constellation, that is the drive for individuation. Like, what's my next step here? What am I able to do?
Yeah. One thing that's really cool to me about this whole line of thing, like just all of these ideas, is that they tie in. I always feel like all ancient teachings, all these different philosophies, spiritual teachings, I feel like they're all of the ones that are valid anyways are pointing towards these kind of just deep truths. One person that's become popular in the manifestation space, especially on YouTube, Reddit, is this guy Neville Goddard. I'm not sure if you've heard of him.
Sure.
But he talks about occupying states. And so he's really, in my opinion, he's saying like the same thing that Jung's talking about when it comes to archetypes or when it comes to these different roles we're playing. But I think what you're saying is extremely important. And Neville talks about this too, and so do the Stoics, that the first thing you have to do is, Neville uses different language, so do the Stoics. Everyone uses their own ways of describing this. Eckhart Tolle says become the observer. Neville Goddard says like become the I am presence, which is behind the role that you're playing, behind the persona, behind the identity that you've taken on. And the Stoics talk about regulating your emotion, and everyone has their own way of saying this, but they're all saying that because that's where your power. That there's a visual aid that I use a lot to explain this to people, which is like there's neutrality that exists in the middle. Then there's like these heightened emotions of like excitement, desire, like I want this thing so bad. You could think about that as like attachment or this overly excited type of energy. And then there's like the fearful avoidant energy, which is like, oh, I don't know if I deserve this. I'm not good enough for this. But both of these are polarities. And if you look at like the Hermetic teachings, the 7 Hermetic principles, everything is a polarity, right? Like light, dark, hot, cold. And really, what we're looking for when it comes to our emotional states is to get into that more space of neutrality, because then we're able to objectively, see things more objectively, not get so caught up in the identity, or much like you said, the persona that we're playing, or this storyline that we're really materializing, because it's becoming like a self-fulfilling thing, because we're thinking like, oh, this and this, and it's like we're tying all these things together, that it may be in a way where we're a lot, oftentimes when I think when we're in either of those polarities, we have a lot of blind spots. We're not able to see things exactly as they are. So I
Yeah,
really kind of,
but I would also say, I mean, I come at it from a different perspective than the Stoics. I mean, I don't think being neutral. I don't think there's any one ideal emotional state, whether it's positive excitement, negative, what we typically call negative, like anxiety, depression, or neutral. It's just about, well, what do you feel and how do you use that feeling? What is the makeup of that feeling? Uh, I would never tell somebody that, oh, if you're sad, that's wrong or you shouldn't be there. I mean, psychology is completely outside of the realm of philosophy, of ethics. So it's like, okay, that's sadness. Okay, so that's just good information for you. How do you manage that? You're excited. That's great. How do you manage that? How do you use that? How do you relate with these different emotional states? I think that's the key. And then
yeah,
once you can do that better, then I think, I don't know what how Neville Goddard means it, but then you can then you can shift easier, then you can take on different roles, then you can get to that place, like I always say, you get to that place from which you're able to make the decisions you want to make, and that's
yeah,
the key
and,
behind therapy.
yeah. And I'm not the way that I'm going about this. I'm not telling people like it's wrong to feel sad or like to repress their emotions, but I am saying that as you feel those emotions and as you feel them, then being able to release them. Because if you stay in that state of super giddy excitement, or super super fearful state, or super super sad and depressed state, in my experience, in my own life, and through other people that I've known, you're not as able to create, um you know the life, a life of your choosing. You more become overtaken by those emotions, and they're sometimes then going to lead you down decision making, that otherwise in a more clear-headed state you wouldn't have made. That's the way that I see it.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think the key is to just create a better relationship with the feeling. Like, what is this telling me to do? Like classic example that people think like, oh, this is wrong. I shouldn't be thinking this, is having a suicidal thought. The suicidal thought, the subway comes into the train station and you just want to jump in front of the subway. Now, a lot of people think, okay, that's not right. That's not what I really want to do. And that's true. That's not what you really want to do. However, I would say, that suicidal thought is telling you something about what you're feeling. And I
Hmm.
wouldn't want you to just tune off that thought. Usually a suicidal thought means, yes, uh, I do need to die. A part of me does need to die. What part do I need to kill off? That desire for death, that oblivion of what death must feel like. I don't know if you've haven't had any near death experiences or something, but what that must feel like, that is true. You do need to put yourself through that process. Not
Hmm.
your life, just a part of you. Maybe it's the part of you that's, I don't know, still attached to your ex-girlfriend who dumped you 3 years ago. Maybe it's a part of you who is like really bothered by your dad's political views, but something about you needs to die. And I want you to engage with yourself so that can die. So yeah, you're not, overrun with it.
Yeah, for sure. That leads me into actually wanting to kind of dive into, you mentioned shadow work earlier. Is what you're describing right now a sort of form of shadow work, or how would you describe, like, for somebody, shadow work has become super popular, right? There's that shadow work journal that blew up and stuff, but like, as far as like our conversation today, like, how do you integrate your own shadow? I know
Well,
it's a
your shadow, which Jung really never talks about that much, but other Jungians have, is, I mean, just that part of you that you don't want to acknowledge. I would say it's part of your unconscious that is affecting you, maybe outside of your awareness. So, in the guy who wants to jump in front of the subway, part of his shadow is, on the surface, he doesn't like his dad because he has different political views. But part of his shadow is, oh, I actually really do need my dad's approval. And I want him to love me and show and like say that he's proud of me. Right. I need him to do that. I'm still attached to that. Right. I still have this little boy part of me that needs my dad to do that. I only see it when he starts talking about, whatever he watched on, whatever cable news channel that I disagree with. Right.
Right.
And so part of shadow work would be just understanding that you are attached and what is it about you that still needs that attachment.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would just go through to just make that more conscious, and we're able to, identify that and see it. And, I would never want to say to anybody, oh, you feel like, so you're attached to your dad? Well, just remember that you don't need his approval, which is objectively true. But if that worked, then you wouldn't need therapy, right? Therapy is about going in and, yeah, I don't need my dad's approval, but I still act like I do. And I still get triggered by things that he says. Well, what's going on with me? What insecurities do I have that I'm not looking at? And that's what we would do. And typically, I don't really like that term shadow work. It's just therapy. It's just quality therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapy only touches on that stuff accidentally. I would say it's not technically therapy. I'm not saying it can't be helpful, but it's just really not therapy. And a lot of what I do is just defining. Like we need to be clear about what therapy is, what it's not, what is psychology. And that's a big part of the work that I do, is just defining this stuff, saying this is what psychology is. This is what therapy is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying like you have to do it exactly how I do, but I will also say that if you want your therapy to be helpful, you need to integrate, what I talk about. Otherwise, it's not going to be helpful.
So, to break it down, I know, like as far as shadow work goes, then even, I know you don't like the term, but everybody talks about it. So let's just put that label.
We can call it shadow work. That's the pretentious douchebag part of me who doesn't use stuff like that. So
yeah, that's
part of my growth is just,
your own,
being more open to using those terms, because that's what people use and it's fine.
Yeah. So the big aspect of that is discovering like what you're the aspects of yourself that you kind of don't want to see. You kind of don't want to look at. You kind of put those under the rug, put them in the corner. Right. And so that could be anything, right? You gave the example of approval from the dad, maybe the part of you that wants to, commit suicide, or the part of you that is, maybe a part of you that's very angry, that feels a lot of resentment. There's so many different things that could be, but a lot of it, a
lot of anger is in people's shadows now, given the cultural context that we're in, because anger has become this bad word.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not a bad word. It's really healthy. You need anger to do things in your life. And
yeah, no, I agree. I would argue that by suppressing the anger, like collectively as a society, making people bottle it up, it's actually going to cause a lot more problems. Just like in our own personal lives, if we're have this anger, it's like we need to look at it and acknowledge it, much like you said earlier. I'm not a proponent of bottling up your emotions, but I think, what are some, kind of techniques, or how would somebody go about this if they want to discover these aspects of themselves, the shadow? Is it just, you think, automatic writing? Jung talks about, this practice, active imagination. Like, what do you have people do?
Well, I think the most direct way is, this is my therapy process, I think. Well, so my theory is based on the idea that emotions have a certain structure to them. And so we need to talk through emotions in a certain way to see what's behind there. And that's what the therapy I do is. It's just a continual talking, approaching the emotion in a certain way. And this stuff comes up, and then you can start to put the pieces together. But how I approach emotions is you first have to talk about just what the situation is that's causing this emotional discomfort. Like, oh, my dad's talking about his politics and I'm annoyed. The second part is to just identify what you're feeling. What is the feeling? Which, by the way, like a lot of people, their first time through therapy, just saying the facts of your life and saying how you feel about it, without talking about your dad, without going on like a 15-minute diatribe about your dad and, whatever his thing is. That's a real challenge. This is what happened. This is what I feel. And you got to get good at that first. Then we can start talking about what the feeling means about you, which is, by the way, this is all subjective. The facts, people say, well, did it really happen this way? It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
We are outside the realm of philosophy. We are in psychology. It's not about, we'll figure out, the point of therapy is to develop a better relationship between you and reality, or whatever you think holds the most power in your life, whatever God is to you. Reality, relationships, connection, that takes 99% of it. So then you got to start asking, what does this feeling mean about me? So it could mean, I'm still attached to my dad. Okay, so that's an unconscious. I mean, that would be a shadow thought, a shadow unconscious thing. Oh, I'm still attached to my dad. Look at it. Then we would ask, well, how's the feeling? Okay, so you're annoyed. How is that feeling your responsibility?
Mm.
And the way to look at that is, well, what do I benefit from being annoyed? Well, I get to tell myself how much better I am than my dad.
Mm-hmm.
Or I get to blame my problems on my dad. And so when things don't work out and my girlfriend breaks up with me, I could say, oh yeah, well, it's because of my dad and the fact that he never told me how to talk to girls, right? He's an out of touch boomer. He never told me how to talk to girls. So that's one benefit you have from being annoyed.
Yeah.
And then eventually we get you to the point where you can relate with your dad. Oh, your dad's, doing something annoying. He's saying something annoying, right? And how do you do that, right? How do you annoy him? What things do you do? It's probably this thing that you're doing to try to get his attention, because to get his attention in a more direct way, it's all those feelings are buried behind the shadow stuff. So that's why we go through it, so you can be able to communicate with your dad in a healthy way, and you're not annoyed, the resentments clear up. And that's when you begin to separate from your dad, to let your dad have his own feelings, and so you can have your own feelings. And then I think you get to the state where, Neville Goddard talks about, a lot of people talk about it just being more present and in tune, and it's just you versus reality. It's not you versus reality and your dad's here saying something, right? Because that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, what you just described there, it echoes a lot of sentiments from people like Neville, from people. There's another guy, Frederick Dodson. He literally in his book talks about the same type of process. Like, what is the payoff that I'm getting from having this weird negative emotion, or telling myself this weird story?
Yeah, that payoff is not my original idea. I've gotten that from a bunch of different people. But yeah, the idea of emotional payoff. Like, if you're doing something irrational, that you are getting something.
Mm-hmm.
You are doing something to yourself that is deeply satisfying, and it doesn't have to feel good. Right? It's not about feeling good. It just has to be familiar.
Yeah.
I mean, this is thing, when you work with drug addicts, you realize, oh yeah, heroin doesn't feel good. It feels not bad. You're in a state of a lot of pain, and you want to take that pain away.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of recovery rehab work in that area is just like, well, what are you in pain about? And you take that pain away, you get people to relate with it better, and it works like clockwork. They gradually stop to use less heroin or whatever, because you don't need it anymore. You don't want it.
And heroin could be used as an example here for just any destructive pattern that you keep playing out. Going into that, it's really fascinating to me how the payoff that we seem to get as human beings from dwelling in that sort of victim consciousness, where it's like, it's my dad's fault, or it's their fault. It's so strange. There's something about us as human beings that we like to go there. There's this other psychologist that talks about the drama triangle, where it's like victim, persecutor, and then savior. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of that.
It's crazy how pervasive that is.
I mean, everybody's the same person. You're all three of those is what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, I mean, you switch in and out again, like switching out of the different states or the different roles. They're different archetypes, really. It's wild, but yeah, it's like,
but it feels good. I mean, yeah, like complaining. Complaining's a great payoff. I love complaining. It's a lot of fun.
We're wired for it.
Just like to go into that, say like, oh man, this is great.
Yeah.
And like you build the fantasy that it is this other person, and it becomes really alluring too, because you really can't point to instances where your dad hurt you. Of course he hurt you. It's impossible to raise a child and not hurt the child.
Exactly. And then this is where this ties into these ideas of Neville and these people, is because if you focus anything, your RAS is going to focus in on, if you're looking at that, okay, your lens is looking for, where's all the things that people hurt me, that somebody hurt me. Well, of course you're going to find evidence for it because you're looking for it. But that goes for anything. And that's why it's so important to like rein our consciousness back and be aware of what lens that we're looking at reality through. Because if you start to be aware of these things, I think that's one helpful benefit of what you're talking about here. You start to be aware that, okay, I'm doing this, I'm playing out this destructive pattern. Well, where is it that I've shown up? How is it that I've shown up that could also be contributing to this? It's like you're kind of defogging this lens, this cloudy, distorted lens that you're looking at reality with.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something I forgot to bring up with responsibility. Yeah. So the one benefit, or the one thing you ask is how do I benefit? What's the payoff? Mm-hmm. How does this feel good to me in a sick way? And then how do I relate with my dad? But also, how do I contribute to this situation? Mm-hmm. And usually how we contribute to the situation is we're disconnecting from the person who is annoying us. We're hiding. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So those are really good things to look at. And, it gets really tricky because, there's just some, victimhoods become a real currency in our culture. And it's very, people have their stories. So I would never want, somebody who I see like they're just being a victim. I would never want to convince them to not be a victim. That doesn't work. Mm-hmm. You need to process your emotions. You need to process your unconscious emotions, right? Emotions that affect you outside of your awareness. You need to go through and process those. And I know that if you do that well enough, you will gradually stop being a victim.
Yeah.
It'll probably still come up. I like being a victim. It's a lot of fun. I enjoy complaining. I live in Los Angeles. I still complain about the weather. It's great, but it's gradually going to feel less and less. You're not going to get that same hit, to bring the drug analogy back.
Yeah. And you'll be less
like, oh, why am I doing this? Oh,
less easily triggered, less easily triggered by things, I think.
That's what being triggered is, oh, you're reminding me of something that I don't want to look at.
Right. Yeah.
Don't make me look at that. Yeah, that's what being triggered is. But when you go through therapy, you look at all that stuff. So you really, you can still be, of course, there's always parts of, nobody does a perfect job at awareness. It's just, it's a process. Awareness is a process that you engage with. And that's it.
Right. And I do think, for me personally, a lot of the ideas and a lot of these things, they're all going back to this. It's like, yeah, and it is an ongoing process because there's no such thing as like, I don't know. I agree with you. There's always going to be things that occur that have the potential to trigger us, but it's really about, I believe, cultivating more of that ability, that neutrality, so that we're able to look, because then we're able to look at things more objectively. Like you mentioned, it's like, okay, what is it? In what way have I been showing up that's also contributing to this? In what way can I navigate this to an actual solution rather than causing? It's like every time you lash out at somebody else, it's like you're kind of just throwing more gas on the fire, and so there's just so much. We could talk about this one idea for like the entire video, but I wanted to actually go into some other things. So I wanted to go into like your ideas on integrating the Anima, and I guess if you could give people like a little bit of an introduction on that as well.
Yeah, so the Anima would just be a part of the man psyche that is fundamentally female. I think what that means is, for a lot of men, it means integrating your emotions. Yeah. I guess the biggest way that comes up is, with men in their relationships with women. So a guy who has poor Anima integration, right? His we see this all the time. Like the wife's complaining or something, and he just wants to go in and fix it. And he thinks he's trying to be helpful, but really what's going on beneath it 99% of the time, 100% of the time. Sorry, it's always this way. Usually, if you're just trying to fix your wife's problems, you're afraid of her feelings, right? If she feels something, if she's complaining, if something's not right in her life, then you need to go in and fix it so she doesn't feel that way. So then you can feel calm again. But anima integration here would be to, just engage with your wife's feelings and relate with her over it, as opposed to just trying to fix it all the time. I mean, there's been a bunch of viral videos about this, and
Oh yeah, this is an absolutely like recurring problem.
I remember seeing it. I mean, I'm probably older than you. I remember seeing it being first aware of this idea in White Men Can't Jump. Rosie Perez and I forget who played her boyfriend, the white guy in White Men Can't Jump.
Yeah, I don't know.
What's that guy's name? Woody Harrelson. Right, and she was thirsty, and so he got up and got her a glass of water. She's like, "No, I wanted you to relate over my thirst. Like, what does that mean to me that I'm thirsty, metaphorically?" And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And I think I was probably 10 or something when that movie came out. I'm like, "Yeah, what is she talking about?" But to indicate Jung's point about the anima, about how like there is this part of me that does get that. Like I at the time, maybe this is me just projecting back, who knows, to make it a better story. But at the time I'm thinking, no, there is something there. She is right. Like on the surface, it seems stupid. Like, yeah, he got her water when she was thirsty. That's the right thing to do. But when she still complains about that, you're like, oh, something's going on here. She's speaking to something, right? She wants a connection with him. Right? She feels distance. And I think a lot of times when, oh, my wife's doing all this, my girlfriend's doing all these crazy things I don't understand yet. She's probably just wants to get some emotion out of you because you're tuned out, or she senses you're tuned out or not paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways. There's different perspectives on that. I feel like there's better ways to get somebody's attention. I don't know. This conversation might be a little bit get a little bit hairy, but like that's something that I'm still trying to grasp, because for me personally, like when there's for example, that example right there, if there's water, it's like if there's an issue and I'm thirsty, like I just want the water, like you said. Like I don't want to relate on my feeling of thirstiness. I just want like the actual water so that I can relieve my thirst. But I think that is just it is just, I think that's it's a huge
but what's the
miscommunication.
point? I mean, my challenge is, what's the point? Is it to relieve her of her thirst? Yeah, you can do that. Or is it really just to connect? And I think the water is a great example because it's a great instance to use in the movie because it's so clear. I'll just get you water.
Mm-hmm.
But still, she just wants to connect. I mean, that's what art does. It uses these fabricated stories to tell something that's more true than we would be able to see in real life.
Mm-hmm.
Because in real life, your wife is complaining about something maybe a little bit more nebulous. Oh, like the neighbor's doing something, or,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, right? But just like the water is such a concrete, silly example.
Yeah.
But that's the challenge, right? I think that's the challenge of anima integration. Which is why I would never say. Which is why I never say there's an ideal emotional state. You're in the emotional state that you're in. You're in the feeling state that you're in, and the challenge is to use it in whatever way you can. That's all we're able to do. So,
Interesting.
That's anima integration. I mean, I don't know if we, but yeah, my way of simplifying that is it's really just about men integrating their emotions, and anima integration is what happens a lot in therapy. And then animus integration for women really comes down to developing a sense of self, integrate, usually for women, for men, it's anger too, but for women, it's more so. I think women repress anger more than men generally. And it's just about integrating that, and how does a woman use her anger?
Okay.
That's what that looks like.
Yeah. So I guess just to like cover this before we go on into any other topics, because it is interesting and it's very relevant. A lot of people have this. These issues come up. Is it in your working with men to integrate the anima, like resolve these types of miscommunications? what does that usually end up looking like? Does it, um, in terms of, I guess, their relationships, in terms of their own psychology, like how does that kind of play out when they get in touch with these emotions more?
How does that play out? Well, I mean, I think if your girlfriend is afraid or she's worried and you don't like when she's worried, I think, part of the therapy would be to just get more comfortable with anxiety, to get more comfortable facing the anxiety. I see worry as just a manifestation of anxiety. It's anxiety projected in the future, like, oh, something might not work out, or I'm anticipating a threat that's going to take something away from me. And, I'm not big into techniques or advice. I just think, look, start to manage your emotions, start to manage, in particular, your anxiety. And I think you're going to start to communicate with your wife in a better way. First of all, you're going to be less triggered by
Mm,
her worry, by her anxiety, because now it's more conscious in you. And so you're going to be doing less to try to get her to stop worrying.
mm-hmm.
Your validation is going to fall more back on you and what you're feeling. And I think the conversation with your wife or girlfriend or whoever is just going to be more natural and effortless because of that. Right. And I think this is where constellation and drive for individuation comes from. Well, now that we've processed your feelings, now that we've gone through this and your wife does this thing, you tell me how you can approach the situation in a better way. Because you're in the best situation, you're in the best position to know.
Yeah.
Like whenever somebody asks me, what do I say in this situation? I'm like, I don't know the other person.
Yeah.
Let's
Well,
talk through the situation so you gain more awareness over it. And then you tell me not what you should say, but what you're able to say. What are you able to say? What does
mhm.
that look like?
So at what point with these types of situations, let's say, for an example, wife, girlfriend is coming home and complaining about work and, whatever, they're stressed at work, coworkers, whatever. And it's just, but it's an ongoing thing. It's, every night that she comes from work, it's the same type of thing, energetically, right? Maybe different situations at work, but it's the same thing. At what point does it become this does it become this victim perpetuating this victim kind of story? At what point does it transfer from, okay, hearing her out, sort of empathizing or connecting, versus, okay, well, what are you going to do to solve this? Because this is like a, either it's like you taking matters into your own hands type of thing, like, and
Well,
that solution oriented approach.
yeah. So there's like listening to her, and then there's saying, well, what do we do to solve this? I think there's a point in between there that it's good to listen. But if you do feel like she's complaining, and by the way, maybe she keeps complaining because she doesn't think you're listening. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that she just likes complaining and she's just dumping on you. Well, if you think she's dumping on you, then say that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, like, look, I love you and I'm here to listen to you, but it really feels like you're just using me as a trash can here, and I don't appreciate that.
Right, right. Yeah, I agree. That's why there's always
But
just like,
I would never like try to. I would never suggest you try to solve your wife's problems or girlfriend's problems.
yeah, I think that's a mistake that a lot of men make, myself included, because it's like our whole mindset is like, how do we fix things? We're always looking for solutions, and sometimes we feel as if that's our responsibility. And then we slip into that savior role, right?
Right.
Play out that drama triangle,
Right.
and again, there's a distinction, yeah, and it can be hard to discern that, I think, for a lot of guys sometimes, to say, okay, I care about this person and I want to see them in a better situation, but step out of that kind of instinct that we have to solve the problem, or but yeah, it all requires just bringing
Yeah.
that awareness back.
Discernment, right? And people use that term emotional literacy. You're just becoming more literate with your emotions, and you're able to read your emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get a feeling that says, "Oh, this isn't right. I feel like I'm just being used here," you need to be able to discern that from, "Okay, I'm here to listen."
Right.
And it can be subtle, but I think this is what this is what you do in therapy is you just get more in tune with what you feel, with what you're really feeling, and then you're able to use it in a better way. So that's yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
emotional literacy, that is the outcrop of this process that I'm talking about. Like that's just one benefit. It's like awareness. You become more and more emotionally literate.
yeah. Yeah, awareness. And that comes from presence of being. And that's again why I believe in trying to in my opinion, like cultivating that presence is also going to naturally get you into that more state of neutrality that I was mentioning earlier. Because if I'm start getting reactive, if she comes in this example and starts, getting emotional in this very volatile emotional, and then I start reacting, now I'm compounding the situation and making it worse. We're getting into a big fight that
Right.
could have been avoided, you know, by my own sort of emotional control. Like you mentioned at the beginning of this, what did you call it? Affectation.
Oh, affect regulation. I mean,
Affect
that's what Jung
regulation.
calls it. Yeah, but it's really just emotional regulation.
Yeah, it's like nervous system regulation too, because it's like we literally get into that fight or flight mode when we
That is
perceive.
fundamentally what it is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
if you don't like feeling worried, that's something with your nervous system. It's like a
Yeah,
signal in your nervous system that you just can't handle.
right.
It's
Exactly.
uncomfortable. And so part of regulation, and kind of the head fake that you do when you're talking through your feelings and saying, "Here's what I feel, here's what it means to me, here's how it's my responsibility." You're just sitting with the feeling.
Hmm.
You're just learning that it's okay. So whether it's excitement on one end or sadness, it's like, well, these are all okay. And I guess I understand what you mean by cultivating that neutrality. The only issue I see with that, which I don't know if you're doing, but I see people interpret this all the time, is they interpret that as, okay, I can't have emotions too high or too low. I need to be somewhere in the middle. So when they get excited, they immediately start to repress it, even though nobody tells them to repress it. But they immediately, okay, this might lead to something bad, or sadness might lead to something bad. So I need to get myself out of that somehow, or listen to a music to put myself into a good mood or something.
Hmm.
And I I think it's better to actually engage with that. So when you do get excited, you're not overwhelmed. When you do get sad, right? It's okay to feel that way because you
Yeah,
know what to do with it.
yeah. No, absolutely. I
I have a
think
relationship with that excitement, with that sadness.
yeah, and these concepts get really deep because I think what you end up doing, and you're hitting on this, which is an important point, is if you kind of almost get upset, or if you feel like you need to repress this emotion because it's bad, then that's almost compounding the problem now, because now you're you're
Yeah,
yeah, you're
yeah,
having these other
that's just
things.
more anxiety. That's more avoidance.
Yeah, exactly, exactly, exactly.
Like when FDR said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Right, right.
That hurts me. That just hurts my chest whenever I see that, and I see that echoed throughout the second half of the 20th century in America. I'm like, that is a terrible. No, fear's okay. It's okay to be afraid. In fact, I think we need to be afraid and use that fear to develop a better relationship with others, with reality, which is really the point of therapy and psychological growth. I need
Well,
to
like you
be able
said
to
earlier,
see reality. Yeah.
like you said earlier, it's pointing us. It's giving a it's saying something to us, right? That we need to pay attention to. And if we're constantly repressing all of those signals, whether it's fear or anger, any of these things, then we're not communicating with the universe. And this brings me to the next point that I wanted to touch on with you, which is synchronicity. So I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I have my own understanding of it, but obviously you are very well versed in all these topics. So how do you perceive it? How can we use it and for our benefit?
Well, I mean, synchronicity, Jung just says it's meaningful coincidences. Now, where's that meaning, right? I think that's the question of synchronicity. I'm very strict in my interpretation of what Jung. This is my interpretation of Jung. I understand if somebody reads Jung's and has a different interpretation. I think he just means synchronicity in psychological context. Like you make meaning out of something that gives your life meaning. Now, whether that meaning exists in the external world, I don't know. You're thinking of a friend and your friend calls you right then. Is that a message from the universe, from God, metaphysically? I don't know. I'm not a philosopher. Well, I like to think of myself as a philosopher, but technically I'm just a therapist, right? I just deal in psychology. You make, you develop whatever meaning, whatever ontological import you want to put on that coincidence. That's for you to do. But whether it really exists, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But
So,
even if it is, even if you are just putting your own importance on it, like people think, oh, well, then it's just subjective, so it doesn't matter. No,
well, it's kind
it
of
still
all.
matters because it's about your relationship with yourself. So, the fact that it's subjective makes it matter even more in the context of psychology and philosophy. You're right, then it wouldn't matter.
Right. But as far as your therapy goes, it's not a big aspect of your therapy or like what you discuss or anything. Yeah. So you
No,
kind of just,
I think that's more religion than therapy. Religion is digging up the artifacts. Therapy is I give you the tools so you can dig up your own artifacts.
yeah.
Right. When you find stuff, tell me about it. I'm happy to hear, but I have no opinion one way or another.
Do you, what are your thoughts on like active imagination?
I think it's probably not something that a lot of people should be doing. I mean, active imagination, I don't know if like people on your channel know a lot about it, but it's like just taking a dream scenario that you've had and getting yourself into a relaxed state. It's like waking dreams, basically. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, how do I experience like these symbols in the dream in a more wakeful state? I've never really done it much. Maybe that's something I would look into more. I write down my dreams. I definitely do that. I think that's really important. Well, I don't think you have to do that. I think that's one way of uncovering unconscious content, and a lot of people latch onto. But I think there's lots of ways. So that's psilocybin. I mean, that's become more popular. Psilocybin is a drug-induced active imagination. It's having a waking dream state. I mean, when you're dreaming, your conscious is cut off, so you can just look at different layers of your unconscious. And when you take psilocybin, you do that when you're waking, and you start to make these connections. So that can
So
that can be helpful.
that would be something that you'd probably be more, and that you have more experience with, and that you would maybe recommend people more so than the practice of like active imagination per se would be psilocybin.
Well, not that I recommend psilocybin. I don't think it's gonna, it's like a fun tool. I think like any other drug. I'm
Yeah.
not pro drug. I'm not anti drug. Drugs are tools you can use to help you in this process of
I
becoming more
mean,
aware. But I think that ultimately you need to be in therapy. You need to really start getting honest about the resentment that you feel about your dad. If you don't do that, then all the psilocybin in the world is not going to matter.
yeah, for sure. But I mean, as far as like the recent past, there's been a ton of research into like all of these benefits that can be had from taking. So, I mean, it's like a form of medicine. A lot of these cultures, took it as a form of medicine. So, I think that there is, and I don't have like all the information offhand, but there's been a lot of information that can help with depression. It can help with all kinds of things because yeah, like you said, it is helping us go and like peel back the layers of this onion that our consciousness really is. So, um, yeah, it's,
Yeah, I mean, it can be helpful. I just wouldn't. I mean, it's like steroids, right? Like, yeah, steroids are going to get you bigger, but hopefully, if you're
yeah,
taking steroids, you're going to work out too. And if you don't
exactly.
have a right workout plan, then the steroids aren't going to matter. I
Yeah.
mean, it's probably still going to help. There's probably still going to be some benefit. I get it. I don't know. I mean, and the thing about psilocybin is it has some, uh, well, what is it? It's like stops the breakdown of serotonin. I forget exactly, but it just, it fills your synapses with serotonin. So it's like it has an antidepressant effect from that respect,
Hmm.
which is fine. And I understand people, need antidepressants. I think antidepressants are a great drug. SSRIs are a great drug. I think people get that's overprescribed. People use it in lieu of therapy. So, there's lots of problems with it, but, a lot of people need, you're in a straitjacket. You're in a straitjacket and you're loosening yourself out of it slowly but surely. Antidepressants and SSRI, psilocybin, a good, a heroic dose of psilocybin is going to help you do that a little bit easier. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people take psilocybin and have a panic attack, and they think, "Oh, well, this is wrong." And that I would say, no, that's not wrong. In fact, that was kind of one of the points of these, drug-induced initiation rites in the first place, is to put you in a situation where you are going to die, where you feel like you're going to die, right? And how do you face that? And that's what a lot of initiation rites are. That's what people use. I don't think they use psilocybin for that exactly, but
yeah. Have you heard of like EMDR therapy?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
I think it's like going into the past. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's like one of these things like tapping. I don't know if you like people tap on their face and there's like these points. I think it's something that you do to distract yourself. So in EMDR, instead of tapping on certain parts of your body, you just move your eyes left and right. I think it's just like a distraction thing that you do as you're sitting with feelings and going through. So if you're going through a traumatic experience, but you're also focused on your eyes doing one thing or another, it just makes it easier to process. I don't know if having your eyes move one particular way is really has a benefit on your brain, or just like, I don't know if like tapping on your face is like releasing this like psychic pressure from your body or anything like that. Because, people will tap on if you tap on a doll, you get the same benefit. It's just like doing something. It's like, like sitting through a boring lecture, it can go a lot easier if you do a certain activity like solving a puzzle. Doing something that's very like R complex based, like solving a puzzle, and you can actually digest the lecture easier.
It distracts.
If you're doing something too intellectual, then you're going to get distracted and not listen to the lecture. And I think it's the same thing. Lectures are uncomfortable, emotions are uncomfortable. We need to do things to distract ourselves as we're approaching them. And it can be a helpful technique for that. But, I see it really as only a technique.
I think I may have like mixed it up with something else, because I was thinking about, there's like a therapy where it's like it goes into a memory from the past, and then you relive that memory, but like say a traumatic memory, but you relive it without the trauma or like having happened differently. So maybe I'm getting it confused with something else, because
I think you would do that in EMDR too.
Oh, you do?
You would do that in EMDR, but I've actually never been trained in EMDR. I mean, it was like part of one class in graduate school. But I think it's, something about your eyes. You're moving your eyes in a certain way makes you change the memory or process the memory better. I don't think there's any science to that. I just think, you're going through memories and you're doing this thing that you think is keeping you safe as you do it. And it can be helpful from that perspective.
What are your thoughts on like reliving the experience without the trauma occurring? I guess that aspect of it.
I guess I would have more questions like how exactly do you relive the trauma, or relive the experience without the trauma?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's more helpful to look back and say, you were traumatized. We're not going to do anything about that. We're not going to relive anything. We're not going to change your brain. You're just going to create a better relationship with your trauma. Like, so, people who are abused when they're children, sexually or otherwise, they blame themselves and think, oh, well, I'm the bad one because I was abused. And it just kind of happens naturally because that's the natural thing for a child to think.
Mm-hmm.
A child has no other point of reference, no other frame of reference for interpreting that trauma. Whether, say she's getting hit by a parent or something that's leaving a mark, then you responded in the way that you needed to respond in. That's what you needed to do as a child, right? But now let's look at how you're doing that now. Now let's look at, well, not how you're doing that now, but what that trauma did, how that kind of changed the way that you relate with your emotions. How are you relating with your emotions in that maladaptive way now? Let's get really specific about that. And, I would never want to, trauma can be really informative too. And I wouldn't want anybody to forget about the trauma. Like, like science fiction movies about like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, like you go in and you get just memories erased from a bad breakup or something. No, you need that stuff. I just want you to develop a different relationship with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely see that for sure.
And say that really dark stuff. Say, I was sexually abused and I liked it. Part of me likes it. I'm afraid. Like, is there something wrong with me? Oh, so this predator picked up on me because he knew I was going to like it. You know, there's stuff like that. It's like, no, that's not what it means at all. I think you were adapting in a certain way at the time, and you need to get comfortable talking through that. I don't think moving your eyes in one direction or is going to help that much. But you know, I don't know that much about it. So yeah, but that's my take. If you have a
Have you heard of DBT?
yeah, yeah. You're asking for my thoughts on that?
Yeah.
You know, my thing about DBT or ACT or all these, you know, 3-letter therapies, a lot of them are based on the cognitive behavioral therapy model, which I think is fundamentally broken. I think it's broken because you're not really looking at what an emotion is and how to approach it, which is fundamental to your psyche. And I think DBT or ACT, they have techniques that can be helpful. You know, I'm not saying that stuff can't be helpful, but it's based on a lot of it's based on this model that I think it's broken. I mean, it's based on stoicism, you know, this mind-body dichotomy. Like, we have this higher self, we have this lower self, we have good behaviors, we have bad behaviors. We need to increase the amount of good behaviors and decrease the amount of bad behaviors we have. And I think that works if you're a computer, but you're not a computer, you're a human. And we need to go in, and if there's negative thoughts, you know, wouldn't just want you to change the thought. Like, no, that's telling you something. We need to decode it, right? It's your unconscious is speaking to you in these symbols and this language and this catastrophization, and we need to go in and change it, or not change it, but we need to approach it first and not just reframe it, right? Not just reframe it as, oh, my girlfriend broke up with me, I'm sad. Well, are you sad, or are you just excited that you can go out and date somebody new? No, you're sad. You're sad. It means something about you that your girlfriend broke up with you. Now, it may not be conscious, but we got to go and figure out what that is.
Yeah, I've heard that DBT specifically has been effective with for people with like those cluster B personalities, like narcissism and borderline and things like that. But I
Yeah.
don't,
Well,
I don't, I don't know much about the depth of it.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know about that research, but I do know how this research works in graduate school. And probably what happened is people, there was government grants going out for people who experimenting with DBT. And so people change their research around and say, okay, here's like cluster B, that's a problem. DBT, here's something we get money for. Let's show how DBT helps cluster B. And you know, a lot of that can be true, because just getting somebody in therapy and talking in a therapeutic framework has been shown, you know, just through meta-analysis, to be better than nothing.
Yeah.
To be better than not talking. Even if you're just going in and complaining, there is some therapeutic benefit to that. And you may start to connect the dots on your own. Not necessarily. And so I just think any therapy that people do, maybe there is something about DBT, but I see, I mean, my rebellion against the whole system and why I dropped out of graduate school eventually is because I'm like, that this is not addressing. I've taken classes on DBT, and I'm just sitting there thinking that you're not addressing the issue. You're treating therapy like it's this philosophy, and it's not. You need to understand that people have these unconscious things that affect them outside of their awareness. So you're not going to deal with this stuff in any typical way. And I just think DBT, CBT, that's the one I push back against the most.
Mm-hmm.
There's ACT, you know, there's short-term solution focused therapy, you know, whatever. There's all these that are offshoots of that. And I'm saying the actual philosophical approach that this is based on, and it's, I mean, a lot of this does come from Albert Ellis, who was rational emotive behavioral therapy. And he based it, and he was very clear. He said he based it on Stoicism. He was a big student of the Stoics.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of problems with Stoicism because I think it's a philosophy. You know, when you're living in Greece and you see that Rome, that your civilization is dying and Rome is overtaking your country, and you know there's nothing you're going to do about it, yeah, you develop a Stoic philosophy. You develop a philosophy where your happiness is more hinged on your internal state, as opposed to how are you really dealing with reality. I think it's kind of a give up. You're kind of giving up implicitly.
Interesting. I know, like, going back to the cluster B thing, from my understanding, like, a lot of those disorders, or whatever you want to call them, they're, you know, if you get into like psychopathy and things, and narcissistic traits, and a lot of it is, you know, those dark triad traits, that a lot of them are like, you know, I like to inflict kind of like pain on other people, whether it be emotional, physical. It's almost like this I want to hurt people type of thing. Do you think that that's something that can be helped with, you know, going and exploring the shadow, and the type of therapy that you, because I don't know, again, I don't know the details of DBT, and I'm not sure in what capacity they help people kind of resolve those desires, or whatever you want to say. But how would you go about, if you were to working with somebody and like you're exploring the shadow, and they're like, yeah, I just want to kind of, you know, inflict this emotional pain on this other person, or this physical pain, like how would you, um I don't know, I know it's probably a tough question, but I'm just curious, like how would you reconcile that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's tough to answer these questions unless the situation is more specific. But I can make assumptions, and in this case, I would assume if somebody's sadistic or something, or inflicting pain. By the way, just full transparency, I was just looking up cluster B. I'm like, what's cluster B again? Like, I know I had to like write it, like, you know, answer that at some point. But I think that's kind of why it's good to get a formal education if you can. I mean, there's lots of problems with the psychology establishment, but it is good to get a formal education, because then you hear something like cluster B and you're like, oh yeah, I know what to do with that. Not that you need a formal education. But anyways, I would just assume, oh, you're hurting somebody, that's a payoff. I would say that's an emotional payoff. And you probably feel powerless in this situation, so you just have to look at how you feel powerless. You probably want to control something, so you look at what insecurities do you have that makes you want to control. You know, like sadism. You know, like when it comes to domestic violence, a man hits a woman not because he feels, you know, it's not because he's like powerful or some patriarchy. He's just like, this is what he has against women. And so this is his way of like getting through to her, right? If you don't feel like you can do it anyway, or like a woman, you know, she may do typical things like maybe emotional manipulation, typically, because women are better at that. I mean, I guess maybe that sounds sexist, but yeah, you know, reality is sexist. And so I think that's okay. And, you know, you just look at, you know, what state are you in where you think you have to hurt somebody, whether it's through manipulation, whether it's by hurting them? How do you get to that state? What is that really about? You probably feel powerless, you know, with men, typically men who beat their girlfriends or wives. It's they don't feel like they can express themselves in any other way. They don't know how to. And so it really comes from this place of just not being able to communicate well, typically. You know, barring a more specific example, that would probably cover 99% of sadism or narcissism. I mean, narcissism is it's another word that gets thrown around a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And it's like it's more of an implied sadism. Like, I need you to be a certain way, so I'm okay.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like who I am. I mean, narcissism is the guy who gets annoyed at his dad for, you know, having different politics. Like, so what? You're not going to be okay unless your dad has okay politics or politics that you think is okay. I mean, that's total narcissism. Who I am, my identity impinges on how other people are, and I need them to change for me to change. Right? That's the general narcissistic way of looking at the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people are maybe at home listening. No, I do that. Am I a narcissist? No, it doesn't mean you're a narcissist. That's not a diagnosis. Everybody has these traits. It's just like if it becomes overwhelming or affects your life in a certain way, then maybe somebody could say it's narcissism. But I'm less concerned about the diagnosis and more concerned about, well, why are you there in the first place? Yeah, you're telling me I have a fever. Well, why do I have a high fever? What's the virus in me? My body's doing something, right? It's increasing the temperature so it can kill off the virus. Well, let's approach the virus so we don't need to develop the fever in the first place. And that's what sadism, that's what cluster B personality, that's what a lot of these payoffs are. It's a fever. It's not the real issue.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I know we're hitting over the hour, so we'll wrap up here in a second, but it's really interesting to me how you mentioned that term, the virus. And it seems like, collectively, we talked earlier about how in the culture, like this victim consciousness has permeated so deeply into the culture that it seems like there's just this sort of mind virus of sorts, sort of like psychological warfare going on, where people are more and more, you see these kinds of traits, and in group think, it's like my group against this group, and because I'm have these ideas and they don't agree, they must be terrible people, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot that just, bringing that awareness back. I think just being more discerning of, like, in the world as well, on a global level, like, why is it that this certain group is doing this? How does this play out? I think that as human beings, we can, and people are, yeah, we're in a pretty crazy time with all the growth of technology, with everything going on in the world. I think it's important for people to kind of, you know take a step back and really be discerning with things, and why are certain messages being promoted in the ways that they are, and who's benefiting from it, and all of that. But it's been a fascinating, yeah, without taking it too far
Yeah.
off into another conversation here. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I appreciate your time. And for anybody that's been watching this, I'm going to leave a link to Mark's channel down below, so you guys can check out his channel as well as his website and all of the different things he has to offer. So thank you very much. Hit
Yeah,
this
thanks for
channel.
having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this stuff because I love doing it. I love talking. I love writing about it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and for everybody that's watching, like I said, I'll leave his links down below. Thank you for watching. Hit me with a subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.